Close your eyes. It's 2 a.m. in 1820s London. It's pouring rain, and you aren't wrapped in a warm blanket in your bed. Instead, you are kneeling on cold, wet dirt in a graveyard, surrounded by fog thick enough to choke on. The smell of wet earth and decay is overwhelming. In your hands is a shovel, and below you is a wooden box containing your neighbor, who was buried just 12 hours ago. This isn't a crime. Well, it technically is, but tonight it's just business. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows to see what life was really like for the people who turned death into a booming industry. Go ahead and dim the lights, fix your pillow, and settle in. You're safe right here in the present, but for the next hour, I'm going to take you somewhere dark, somewhere uncomfortable, and somewhere surprisingly funny if you have a twisted sense of humor like I do. Hey everyone, welcome back to another evening of historical chaos. I'm glad you're here to relax, or at least try to, as we look at the absolute madness of the past. Today, we are talking about the Resurrection Men. Now, that name makes them sound like magic guys, right? Like they have a wand and say, hocus pocus, and everyone gets up for brunch. Yeah, not so much. These guys were grave robbers. But not the kind that look for gold teeth or fancy jewelry. No, they were looking for something much more valuable. Dead bodies. It sounds absolutely horrifying, and it was, but you have to understand the context of Victorian London. It was a time of massive contrast. You have the ultra-rich wearing silk-top hats, and you had people literally selling their clothes for food. And right in the middle of this mess was the medical field. Medicine was booming. Everyone wanted to be a doctor. But to be a doctor, you need to know what's inside a human being. Makes sense, right? You can't just fix a broken leg by guessing where the bones are. The problem was, in early 19th century England, the law was, let's call it, particular. There was only one legal way to get a body for dissection. You had to use the body of a criminal who was executed for murder. That was it. If you died of the flu, or consumption, or got run over by a carriage, you were supposed to stay in the ground. Imagine being a brilliant surgeon in 1820. You have a class of 50 students eager to learn. You need bodies, but you have zero legal way to get them. So what do? Do you stop teaching? No, that's not how the medical community worked. They decided to look the other way. They basically created a don't ask, don't tell policy with the local criminals. The doctors would put up a notice board, no signature, just a price. Fresh body required, top dollar paid. It's almost comical in a dark way. It's like putting a classified ad in the paper for illegal activity. Wanted, 1 corpse, no questions asked, bring your own shovel. And this is where our main characters come in, the Resurrection Men. These were not sophisticated criminals. They weren't masterminds planning high-stakes heists. They were guys who were often too lazy to get a real job, but not smart enough to hold up a bank. They realized that a fresh corpse was worth anywhere from 2 to 10 pounds. To put that in perspective, that was more than some people made in a month of manual labor. So they started digging. Let's float over to how this actually worked.
because it wasn't just walking into a cemetery and shouting, "All right, who wants to be a medical student?" First, you had to find a fresh grave. You couldn't take one that was too old. Well, you could, but the smell would be aggressive, and the doctors didn't want to work on a body that was already falling apart. They needed fresh meat. They would go to the poorer cemeteries, the ones that didn't have high stone walls or guards. They'd look for the fresh mounds of dirt. It was like a gruesome treasure hunt. The technique they used was actually quite clever, which is terrifying. They didn't dig up the whole grave. That takes hours. You'd get exhausted, sweaty, and probably get caught by the night watchman. No, they developed a shortcut. They would dig a small hole at the top end of the grave, right over the head of the coffin. They would use a sturdy crowbar to break the wood, and then they would use a hook, like a giant metal fishing hook, to latch on to the corpse's neck or armpits. Then they'd just pull. It sounds like something from a horror movie, right? But it was highly efficient. They could get a body out in about 15 to 20 minutes. It's almost impressive if it wasn't, stealing a human being. Then they'd take the body, cover the hole back up because they didn't want to make it too obvious, and drive off in a cart to the hospital.
And the doctors, they were waiting. They didn't care where the body came from. They didn't ask, "Oh, did this guy happen to pass away naturally, or did you assist him?" They just paid the cash, took the body, and started lecturing. It's an ironic contrast, isn't it? The same people who were tasked with saving lives were directly funding the desecration of the dead. It's like a chef buying meat from a guy who just stole a cow from a neighbor's yard. You want the product, you don't ask about the supply chain. The families of the deceased were absolutely terrified. Imagine burying your mother and then having to worry that she's going to be dug up and dissected by a bunch of 20-year-olds who were just trying to pass anatomy class. This fear created a whole new industry. People started invented things to protect their dead. They had mort safes, which were these massive, heavy iron cages that were placed over the coffin inside the grave. It basically turned the grave into a jail cell. Others would hire guards to sit by the grave all night with a shotgun. It was a massive waste of money, but what can you do? You'd rather spend your savings than have your grandpa show up on a student's table. The humor in this, if you can call it that, is how the law reacted. If the resurrection men were caught with a body, the police couldn't actually charge them with stealing the body itself. Why? Because legally, a dead body wasn't considered property. You can't steal something that doesn't belong to anyone. It's a ridiculous legal loophole.
However, if they were caught with the clothes that were on the body, that was theft. So the resurrection men would get caught, and the judge would say, "I can't charge you for stealing the corpse, but you stole that woolen shirt. That's 5 years in prison." It's almost like a cartoon. The law is so focused on the technicality that it misses the whole point. The resurrection men were often very brazen, too. They didn't just operate in secret. They would sometimes show up at the back door of a hospital in broad daylight, delivering a body like they were delivering a load of bread. There was a famous group in London called the Borough Gang. These guys were the professionals.
They had connections with the hospital porters. They knew which cemeteries were poorly guarded, and they ran the market. They would even pay off the grave diggers to tell them which graves were the easiest to access. This brings us to a really dark twist in the story. What happens when the demand for bodies is higher than the supply of freshly dead people? Well, the Burrow Gang didn't let that stop them. If the cemetery was empty, they would go out and make more bodies. It's the ultimate horrific example of supply and demand. If no one is dying fast enough, you create a market opportunity. It's incredibly tragic, and yet, in the most cynical, dark way, it's just business. The people they targeted were usually vulnerable, the homeless, the lonely, people who wouldn't be missed right away. They would trick them or just kill them and then sell them to the doctors. It was a vicious cycle.
This story, like many others in history, shows us that the line between civilized society and absolute savagery is incredibly thin. It only takes a little bit of demand, a little bit of money, and a lack of empathy to turn the most horrifying acts into a routine workday. Imagine sitting in your house, knowing that just a few miles away someone is digging up your family, and the police couldn't care less as long as the bodies are dressed in rags. It's a world where the night belongs to the ghouls, and the day belongs to the people who buy their products. But the doctors didn't want to stop it. They needed the bodies. And the resurrection men didn't want to stop it. They needed the money. And the poor families? Well, they were just in the way. We're going to take a closer look at the specific individuals who ran this trade in the next part. But for now, just think about that. Think about the audacity of it. Think about the fear of the people. And think about how easy it is to break the rules when everyone is pretending not to see it happen. Imagine the sound of heavy iron wheels on wet stones. That was the sound of the resurrection men at work. They didn't have fast cars. They had broken-down carts and tired horses. And they didn't operate in the shadows of the night. They operated in the silence of the night, which was somehow much more terrifying. So the Burrow Gang has realized they have a gold mine. They are supplying bodies to all the major hospitals in London. But here's the thing about doing illegal work. You can't exactly go to the Better Business Bureau when someone steals your tools. The competition was fierce. You had different gangs covering different territories. There was a constant threat that another gang would try to rob your grave, or worse, rob you while you were working. It was a paranoid existence.
This is where the dry humor of the era comes in. They had to be incredibly discreet, yet they were moving dead bodies through the streets. They would wrap the bodies in heavy canvas, sometimes dressing them in old coats to make them look like drunk passengers in the cart. Imagine being a police officer in 1820s London. You stop a cart at 2 a.m. It's freezing cold. The driver smells like gin and dirt. He tells you he's just taking his sleeping brother home. You look in the back, and it's just a lumpy shape under a tarp. You don't want to check. You really don't want to check. It's an ironic contrast. The city was obsessed with morality and propriety, but at night, it was run by ghouls. Let's look at the financial aspect of this, because it's absolutely mind-boggling. A fresh body was worth, say, £8. That was a lot of money. But a body that was damaged, maybe they dropped it, or the crowbar broke a rib, was worth less. So they developed a kind of quality control.
They were actually looking for healthy bodies.
This created a massive panic. The rich, of course, had solutions. They would pay for guards to stay at the cemetery overnight. They would build those mort safes I mentioned, heavy iron cages. But what about the poor? The people who couldn't afford a guard or a cage? They would take turns. Imagine sitting in a cold cemetery in the pouring rain, holding a rusty shovel, just to make sure your husband isn't dug up. It's a tragic scene, but it's also oddly human. The desperation of trying to protect a loved one from such a grotesque fate. And the irony is that the doctors, the ones buying these bodies, were often seen as heroes. They were curing diseases, saving lives, but they were doing it by creating a demand for crime. It's like a person who loves fancy wooden furniture, but ignores the fact that their supplier is clear-cutting a national park. The Burrow Gang, in the middle of all this panic, started to feel untouchable. They had bribed the cemetery watchmen. They had connections with the hospital porters who took delivery at the back door. They were running a professional, albeit horrifying, business. But the law was starting to catch up, not because of the grave robbing, but because of the sheer noise they were making. The watchmen were seeing shadowy figures, and that's when the gang decided to do something even more brazen. They stopped just taking bodies from cemeteries.
Now here's where the fog gets thicker. Up until now, you could almost pretend this was just a grotesque side hustle. Dig, hook, pull, sell. A terrible business model, but still technically recycling what was already dead. Morally bankrupt, yes, but murder? Not yet. That changes now. Because once you create a market for something and that market pays well, human creativity does the rest. And creativity, when mixed with greed, can become very inventive. The Burrow Gang had territory, they had contacts, they had timing, but London in the 1820s was not producing corpses fast enough to satisfy every anatomy lecture in the city. Hospitals were expanding, medical schools were competing, students were paying high fees, and those students expected a body on the table, not an apology. You can almost picture the tension. A surgeon stands in front of 50 eager young men in waistcoats and ink-stained cuffs. He has a scalpel in his hand. He clears his throat, and there is nothing on the table. That's not good for business. So the resurrection men began to ask a question that would permanently stain their legacy. Why wait for nature? London at this time was packed with the vulnerable. The city had swollen during the Industrial Revolution. People flooded in from the countryside looking for work. Many found it, many did not. Entire neighborhoods were built out of desperation, not planning. Damp basements, overcrowded rooms, families stacked on top of each other like crates in a warehouse. And then there were the people who had no one, no family, no savings, no stable job, the kind of people who could disappear without a headline. This is where the line snaps.
One of the most infamous examples didn't even happen in London. It happened in Scotland, but it terrified all of Britain and shook the entire resurrection trade to its core.
Let's step into Edinburgh for a moment and meet two men whose names still make historians pause. They weren't sophisticated criminals. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were boarding house keepers, ordinary men, the kind you would pass on the street without thinking twice. In 1828, one of their tenants died owing them rent. Now, pause for a second. A tenant dies. That's unfortunate. But here's the thought that followed. Instead of burying him, why not sell him? They took the body to a respected anatomist in Edinburgh named Robert Knox. Knox paid them. No questions, no paperwork, just cash. And suddenly, a light bulb flicked on. If one dead tenant is worth money, what about another? Except the next one didn't die naturally. Burke and Hare developed a method that was chillingly practical. They would intoxicate their victims, suffocate them by compressing the chest and covering the mouth and nose. It left very little visible injury. No blood, no obvious trauma. It became known later as burking. They delivered body after body to Dr. Knox's lecture hall, fresh, undamaged, prime condition. Students crowded around the table, scribbling notes, completely unaware that the body in front of them had been laughing, walking, and breathing the day before. 16 people were murdered in less than a year. 16.
And the entire operation ran on silence. Knox didn't ask. Burke and Hare didn't tell. The money flowed. The lectures continued. When the truth finally surfaced, it caused outrage that was volcanic. Crowds gathered. Effigies were burned. The public realized that the fear wasn't just about grave robbers anymore. It was about becoming inventory. Burke was executed. Hare turned King's evidence and vanished. Knox's reputation was destroyed, though he was never convicted. But here's the important part. While Burke and Hare operated in Scotland, their crimes sent shockwaves straight into London. Every resurrection gang suddenly felt the heat, because the public started asking a very uncomfortable question. How many of these fresh bodies were not fresh from the grave? Back in London, the Borough Gang watched the headlines with clenched jaws. They had always told themselves they were just digging, just supplying, not killing. But the market didn't care about moral distinctions. The hospitals still needed bodies, and now cemeteries were being guarded more aggressively than ever. Mort safes became more common. Families formed night patrols. Some communities installed watchtowers overlooking burial grounds. Imagine that, a watchtower in a cemetery, like a medieval fortress built to defend the dead. The cost of stealing a corpse was rising, and when the cost of supply rises, so does the temptation to cut corners. There were rumors, whispers, stories of resurrection men following the elderly home, stories of strangers offering drinks to lonely laborers, stories of people last seen getting into a cart. Were all of them true? Probably not, but enough were true to keep the fear alive. Let's go back to that image of London at 2 a.m. Rain on cobblestones, fog swallowing lamplight, a cart creaking slowly through narrow streets. Inside, wrapped in canvas, is a body that did not die peacefully in bed. The driver doesn't look nervous. He looks tired. This is routine now. At the hospital's rear entrance, a porter opens the door. He doesn't ask for details. He checks for visible damage. He weighs the body with his eyes. Then he hands over a small pouch of coins. Transaction complete. Inside, under bright oil lamps, students lean forward in anticipation. They're about to learn about the human heart. They don't know they're staring at the consequences of supply and demand gone feral. The moral gymnastics here are extraordinary. Doctors argued that anatomical knowledge saved lives, and they were right. Dissection led to breakthroughs, surgical precision improved, mortality rates dropped over time. But at what cost? Is it acceptable to ignore murder if it accelerates medical science? That question hovered over London like the fog itself. Meanwhile, the resurrection men were living in constant paranoia. Competition intensified. Gangs began stealing from each other. Imagine digging up a body after hours of freezing labor, only to discover another gang had already hooked it and dragged it out earlier that night. There were fights in graveyards, knives drawn among tombstones, men wrestling in mud over a corpse. It sounds absurd, and yet it happened. The money was too good. £8 for a healthy adult male, less for women, less for children. There was even a crude pricing hierarchy. Strong bodies fetched more. Visible disease reduced value. Advanced decomposition was almost worthless. Think about that for a moment. A human life reduced to a sliding scale.
The public anger kept building. Newspapers sensationalized every rumor. Caricatures depicted doctors as vampires. Resurrection men were drawn as skeletal demons with shovels for hands. Church sermons thundered against moral decay. Politicians squirmed. And yet, behind closed doors, the anatomy theaters were still full. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Society wanted the benefits of modern medicine. It just didn't want to see the machinery. This tension was unsustainable. Something had to give, and it did. But before we get to that turning point, you need to understand the atmosphere, the daily dread, the way death itself felt unstable. Imagine being poor in 1828 London. You work in a factory 12 hours a day. You live in a damp room with 2 other families. Your child gets sick. There's no antibiotics, no proper sanitation. He dies. You scrape together money for a simple burial. You stand in the rain as the coffin is lowered. You whisper a prayer. And then you take shifts at night guarding the grave. Because grief wasn't enough. You had to defend it. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, wealthy medical students dissect a body in a heated hall, joking nervously to mask
By the end of the 1820s, public outrage was no longer manageable. Burke and Hare had exposed the logical end of the resurrection trade. If grave robbing was tolerated, murder would follow. The line had been crossed, and Parliament could no longer pretend not to see it. In the next part, we're going to step into the political storm that followed, the debates, the protests, the eventual law that tried to fix this broken system. But ask yourself something before we move on. If you were a doctor in 1828 and you genuinely believed that dissection would save thousands of future lives, would you ask where the body came from? Or would you keep your eyes on the scalpel and let someone else worry about the dirt under the fingernails? That's the uncomfortable space we're standing in now. The resurrection trade wasn't just about criminals in graveyards. It was about a society that quietly agreed to look away. And when a society looks away...
By the late 1820s, the graveyards were no longer quiet places of mourning. They were battlegrounds, not just between resurrection gangs, but between public fear and political denial, between medical ambition and moral outrage, between the living and the way they treated their dead. Burke and Hare had detonated the illusion. You could no longer pretend this was just a matter of disturbed soil and stolen shrouds. The newspapers had made sure of that. Their names were printed everywhere. Pamphlets circulated. Street ballads were sung. Caricatures showed doctors with blood on their cuffs and coins in their pockets. And in London, Parliament felt the heat. Let's step inside the House of Commons for a moment. Picture it. Candles flickering, dark wood benches, the low hum of men arguing in measured tones, while outside crowds gather in the cold air. Inside, the debate sounds civilized, polite, technical. But beneath the language is panic. Because here's the problem. Everyone knows the resurrection trade exists. Everyone knows doctors are buying bodies. Everyone knows families are terrified. And yet, the law itself created the shortage. Remember the original rule: only executed murderers could be legally dissected. That law had been designed centuries earlier as an additional punishment. Dissection wasn't about science then. It was about humiliation, about denying the criminal a proper burial. But by 1828, executions were decreasing. Reforms had already begun to reduce the number of capital crimes. Fewer hangings meant fewer legal bodies. And medical schools had multiplied. Demand was climbing, supply was shrinking.
You don't need an economics degree to know what happens next. So Parliament began discussing reform, and the debate was not simple. On one side, you had surgeons arguing that anatomical knowledge was essential. They pointed out something uncomfortable but true. Dissection saves lives. If a doctor understands the human body intimately, surgical errors decrease, misdiagnoses drop, recovery improves. On the other side, you had furious citizens who believed their loved ones were being treated like spare parts. The streets of London had already seen riots over suspected grave robbing. There were instances where anatomy schools were attacked, windows smashed, doors broken, crowds demanding to see proof that the bodies inside had been legally obtained.
Imagine being a medical student during this time. You're studying to heal people, but you walk home at night knowing your profession is associated with murderers and grave robbers. It's not a comfortable position. And then there's the class issue. Because here's the detail that stung the most. It was almost never the wealthy who ended up on dissection tables. The rich could afford guarded graves. They could afford family plots with stone vaults. They could afford private watchmen and iron cages. The poor could not, which meant that even in death, inequality persisted. The bodies used for medical advancement were overwhelmingly those of the working class, the homeless, the forgotten. The same people who had struggled in life were now fueling scientific progress in death.
That imbalance was explosive. Politicians realized that if they didn't act, public trust in both government and medicine could collapse. Enter the solution that would reshape the entire system. The Anatomy Act of 1832. At first glance, it looked like a clean fix. Instead of relying on executed criminals, the act allowed licensed anatomists to dissect unclaimed bodies. Specifically, those who died in workhouses, hospitals, and prisons and were not claimed by relatives within a certain time frame. On paper, this solved the supply issue. No more grave robbing, no more midnight digging, no more dependence on criminal gangs. Doctors could now obtain bodies legally. Resurrection men would become obsolete. Problem solved. Except, of course, it wasn't that simple. Because who were the unclaimed? They were the poorest of the poor. Workhouses were filled with people who had nothing, no money for burial, no family able or willing to claim them. Under the new law, if you died destitute, your body could legally become a teaching specimen. The fear shifted. Before 1832, people feared being dug up after burial. After 1832, people feared dying poor. Imagine that shift psychologically. The graveyard no longer needed guarding. The institution itself was the pipeline. If you entered a workhouse and died there, you might not receive a funeral at all. Instead, you could end up on a slab under bright lamps, surrounded by students.
The resurrection men slowly faded from relevance. There was no longer a profitable black market for corpses. Hospitals could acquire them through official channels. But public trust did not instantly repair itself. Many families feared that hospitals would deliberately misclassify bodies as unclaimed, that the bureaucracy would swallow the dead and quietly pass them along. And to be fair, oversight in the early years was far from perfect. Let's zoom in on a small but telling detail. Under the Anatomy Act, if a person explicitly objected to dissection before death, their wishes were supposed to be respected. But how many illiterate, impoverished individuals even knew they needed to object? How many had the legal knowledge or paperwork to assert that right? The law favored those who understood it. The poor often did not. So while the act ended the dramatic graveyard battles, it institutionalized a different kind of inequality.
Now, to be fair, the act did achieve its primary goal. Grave robbing sharply declined. Resurrection gangs dissolved. The night carts with canvas-wrapped bodies became rare. Anatomy schools flourished under regulated supply. Surgical knowledge improved. Over time, medical standards rose dramatically. In the long arc of history, this reform contributed to the development of modern medicine. But it came at a moral cost. Think about the symbolism. Before, a gang of criminals with shovels stole the dead in secret. After, the state itself quietly redirected the bodies of the poor into lecture halls.
One is chaotic and violent. The other is bureaucratic and clean. Which feels worse? That depends on your perspective. There's an unsettling irony here. The resurrection men were widely hated. They were caricatured as monsters, and in many ways they were. But the system that replaced them did something arguably more chilling. It normalized the process. It turned corpses into inventory through paperwork instead of crowbars. And here's the deeper tension that historians still debate. Without the Anatomy Act, medical progress might have stalled. With it, the poorest citizens bore the burden. Is that trade-off justified? That question doesn't have a simple answer. Step back for a moment and look at the broader cultural shift. After 1832, the image of the doctor slowly transformed. Instead of being shadowed by grave robbers, physicians became symbols of scientific advancement. Hospitals expanded, training improved, public health initiatives began gaining traction. But the memory lingered. Parents still told stories of the resurrection men. Graveyard fear became part of urban folklore. The idea that your body could be stolen or sold stayed embedded in cultural memory for generations. And in a strange twist of fate, the very men who once dominated London's cemeteries faded into obscurity. No statues, no memorials, just footnotes in history books and whispered tales in dimly lit rooms. Yet their existence forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. When law fails to align with reality, black markets thrive. When demand is ignored, supply finds a way. And when institutions quietly benefit from crime, morality becomes negotiable. The Anatomy Act was Parliament's attempt to reconcile those tensions.
It didn't make the past cleaner. It simply redirected the future. So now, imagine London in the mid-1830s. The rain still falls. The fog still rolls in from the Thames, but the graveyards are quieter. No hooks, no crowbars, no hurried shoveling in the dark. Instead, the silent transfer happens inside institutional walls. A clerk records a name, or perhaps no name at all. A body moves from one room to another. Students gather. A lecture begins. The age of the resurrection men is over, but the ethical shadow they cast stretches far beyond their shovels. In the next part, we're going to step away from Parliament and into the anatomy theaters themselves. We'll look at what actually happened once a body crossed that threshold, who handled it, how it was treated, and what it meant for the young men who stood around those tables trying to balance curiosity with conscience. Because stealing a body is one thing, opening it is another.
Keep the lights low. We're about to walk into the room where the real work happened.